Hello and welcome to the annual lecture by the Good Governance Institute. I'm Anna Barnes and I'll be guiding today's session. As of last week, I started work on CQC compliance, specifically the well-led standard at University Hospital of Sussex, but previous to this, I was the Associate Director for the Integrated Programme at South West London and St George's Mental Health Trust, which was the redevelopment of the Springfield site. But with relevance to today, I serve as chair of the Seaview Project in St Leonards. The charity provides support services for marginalised individuals dealing with addiction, mental health issues, ex and at-risk offenders and rough sleepers, helping them achieve personal growth and fulfilment. Today's annual lecture is part of the GGI's Festival of Governance, the 9th year of the festival, and this year the theme is Good Governance because Scarcity is Real. So with my role in the voluntary sector, of course, we do live and breathe scarcity. We have to fund some services ourselves because the local authority can no longer afford to pay us what they cost to run. We work with people who are right at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of need, to the extent that at any given time, 50 people using our services have no shelter, food or means of support. However, today, I think we'll be interpreting scarcity in its broadest sense and exploring the opportunities it brings, as well as its limitations, fitting within the context of the cost of living crisis, but also in terms of those of us yearning to live a simpler and more sustainable life with regard to our impact on the planet. So it's opportunities as well as the risks. Before we dive into this year's annual lecture by Jane Davidson, who's sitting with us here, I'm delighted to have Sir Michael Marmot to present Jane with the Good Governance Award. Sir Michael won the award in 2021 in recognition of his extensive and dedicated work on health inequalities and evidence-based decision-making. He is the director of the UCL Institute of Health Equity and is best known for his influential report on health inequalities in England, titled Fair Society, Healthy Lives, or the Marmot Review. It's a personal privilege for me to introduce Sir Michael, as I previously worked at NHS Right Care, a population health programme at NHS England, and I do remember your work on showing the life expectancy figures were going down the first time in a generation, and there was demonstration of the link between austerity and life expectancy decreasing, which was like a mind-blowing discovery. And so I felt that was a very brave thing to come out to talk about. So bravery, but also in absolute command of the data at your disposal. So over to you, Sir Michael.
It was a privilege to be the recipient of the Good Governance Award and an extra privilege to, as it were, pass it on. Let me say just a few words. I've been thinking about governance. Let me start with one way of thinking about bad governance. How about 5 prime ministers in 6 years, 7 chancellors of the Exchequer, 7 secretaries of state for health. I've lost count of how many housing ministers. We're in absolute chaos. One description of bad governance has to be the kind of chaos we're now in. How can you possibly develop a program for government when you've had 7 chancellors of the Exchequer in less than 7 years? Absolute chaos. Now that's particular to Britain at the moment. I have a slightly broader approach to what constitutes good and bad governance. I see everything through the lens of health and health equity. Because of the evidence on social determinants of health, we can say that if health is improving, society is improving. If health has failed to improve, society has failed to improve. If health inequalities are getting bigger, inequalities in society are getting bigger. If health for the poorest people is getting worse, circumstances of living for the poorest people is getting worse. And that's what's happened in Britain since 2010. Life expectancy more or less stopped improving. Inequalities in health got bigger. and health for the poorest people got worse. I'd like to say that Wales was better than that, but it wasn't. Wales was like England, only more so. And maybe that's not a fair comparison. Maybe we should be comparing Wales with the northeast or northwest of England, because that's more what it looks like in terms of their health statistics. But I want to come back to Wales in a moment. So why has this happened? Well, given what I said about the social determinants of health, I was commenting on a report yesterday that rickets has gone up, scurvy has gone up. Rickets, scurvy. I could be reading Dickens' Hard Times. Rickets and scurvy. It's already out of date. Last, I think it was November, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report on destitution in Britain. Destitution. In 2022, with the figures, it was defined as doing without 2 or more of housing, heat, light, food, appropriate clothing for the conditions, and toiletries, soap and toothpaste, sanitary products. And 3.8 million people in Britain in 2022, including 1 million children, were in a state of destitution. The Prime Minister likes to claim that absolute poverty has gone down. He should be a bit careful in making that claim. That 1 million children represents a 2.9-fold increase between 2017 and 2022. So we're seeing diseases of malnutrition. We're seeing people die because of poor quality housing. We have excess winter mortality because of cold homes. Cold homes damage children's lungs. They damage their mental health. This is Britain in 2024. It's a pretty grim picture. But there are some bright spots on the horizon, and one of them is in Wales. The Wales, or do I say the Welsh Future Generations Act, really, to my mind, represents the kind of good governance that I'd like to see. It's a country's government thinking about the future, not the date of the next election, not can we give away some goodies before the next election, but the Future Generations Act. Wow. And in what I've just been mentioning about destitution in Britain, I didn't mention the climate crisis. And what we know in Britain, as in many other European countries, if you ask people, as the Gallup organization has done, do you think your children will have a worse life than you, a better life than you, or about the same? 1/3, only 1/3 of people think their children will have a better life than them. And I'm guessing that they weren't taking the climate crisis into account when they answered that question. If they took the climate crisis into account, it would be even worse. So the fact that the Wales Future Generations Act is thinking about our children, our future generations, about the climate, about sustainability, about inequality and equity. How can we create better conditions for the whole of society? When I was asked to introduce you, and I thought, wow, what an opportunity. I asked you when we came in today, were you really the architect of the Wales Future Generation Act? It's just a brilliant piece of not just legislation, but planning for the future, of creating a better society for now and for future generations. It's an absolute privilege to award you this award, to hand you this award, because of what you've done in Wales, and that Wales is potentially a shining light to other countries at how to plan for the future, taking sustainability and inequity into account at the same time, and thinking about the whole of society, not one government department, but the whole of government, all the relevant departments. It's an absolute privilege to be sitting here with you. Can I give you an award?
Oh, look
Jane,
at that.
can I hand you this?
Isn't that absolutely wonderful?
And I should have mentioned that you were responsible for the Wales coastal part.
So this is a scene from St Leonards, donated by the artist Tim Nathan. He really wishes you well, and thank you very much for all you do. And it's a reminder that no matter how bad things get, we can always turn to nature to bring us back to ourselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, thank you to the Good Governance Institute for the work you do, actually, because, Michael, as you were saying, we live in a very odd time where the whole notion about how you take good decisions is under threat. And yet when you and I worked together when I was in Welsh Government back in the early 2000s, we were really focused on evidence-based outcomes. And evidence-based outcomes meant you had to think about not just the decision that you took, but how you took the decision, how people were going to get to the outcome from that decision, and what that was going to mean in terms of improving people's lives. And I think it would be unfair to my parents, to doctor parents, so I've grown up with do no harm, particularly my father, who is a consultant in public health medicine. It was so important, this public health message about the big changes that we've seen in our lives have been about legislation that has cleaned water, that has created sewers. There were big issues straight after the war, for example, when we saw the government actually embrace issues about giving people free education, about giving them housing, about giving them the means to live, the very things which appear to be lacking at the moment. And I have actually, I think, spent the most of my life, my working life, just trying to work out how you can create good decisions. So I'm really a policy nerd. It's extraordinary to be offered an award for being a policy wonk. But essentially, that's what I am. And a walker and a swimmer. So that picture of the sea is delightful. But I just want to say that in the context of the lecture that you're all about to hear, it's actually about taking an opportunity. Because Wales had a real opportunity back in 1999, when devolution first happened, to create a new way of working. And we initially found that that was really tricky. So we had to make sure that if we really wanted to enshrine a way of working that looked upstream, that was about making people healthier, about enhancing biodiversity and bringing more nature back to Wales, about creating livable communities, about looking at current and future generations, then actually we needed to enshrine it in law. And it was a bee-bomb, I think, that it was described as when I left government. And so it was the next administration that had to take it forward. So I'm not the architect of the Act. I'm the architect of the framework of the Act. And it was actually that administration, it was those people, it was the people of Wales created that Act between 2011 and 2015. And we're still learning how to use it. So I hope when people listen to this lecture now, we're on a learning journey. We're still getting our process is right. But I hope you'll be able to see that in the work, for example, that I'm doing in Wales at the moment, trying to see, can we deliver net zero 2035 pathways, i.e. 10-year pathways, to creating a Wales that with a just transition and that is nature positive. Now, it's a big journey and it's a big, ambitious idea we're trying to do. But I hope that people listening today will actually help us on this journey. And thank you all so much. The work of the Good Governance Institute has never been so important. Over to you.
Thank you.
Let me start with a bold statement. I believe that good governance has never been more important than it is at the moment. Dr. Victoria Hirth from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership said in the last couple of weeks, put simply, governance is the way we do things. And I absolutely agree with that. Governance is the way we do things. And it's a way that has served us very badly. It's a way that needs changing so that we look at mission-led, values-led ways of incorporating both current and future generations. Good governance must enable individuals, communities, organisations, countries, and even globally through institutions such as the UN to help deal with the polycrises facing up. And it must also help us do that in as easy a way possible. I'm standing here in front of a slowly turning globe. This globe knows no country boundaries, knows no territorial discussions, knows no wars, but it does know storms and droughts and wildfires and desertification. It does know massive migration. It does know pandemics. It does know the consequences of human behaviour. And on this chart of overshoot days from the Global Footprint Network, you will see that here in the UK, we exceed our land and sea available to us in May of last year. And by exceeding it in May, it means we're using at least 2.5 planets worth of resources. Whereas the worst country on this chart, Qatar, is using 8. Now, how can we have a livable world if we carry on using way more resources than we have available? We have to focus on how we can make less, more and better for current and future generations. And what we would hope to see, if we were successful in this, is that we all note that we live on one planet and that we all have a duty as human beings to recognise our role in natural species in protection of that single planet home of ours. What I want to focus on in this lecture today is how in one small country, the smallest part of mainland UK, 3 million people, 10 million sheep, rethinking our values has enabled us to rethink what governance could look like. The story starts in many ways back in 1999, and we always have to know where a story starts and a journey starts in the context of knowing whether we're going to deliver the outcomes we want to see. So in 1999, devolution came to Wales and a new democracy was born. A new assembly that became a parliament was born. But the most important aspect for this story is that that assembly agreed to act in a way that honoured the Brundtland definition of sustainable development. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Adopted by the UN, that is still the most significant definition of sustainable development that operates across countries across the world. And there was a new duty that was introduced in 1999, where the new incoming government and Parliament of Wales had a duty to promote sustainable development in everything that it did. And it was really hard to deliver, because how do you promote sustainable development? So fast forward to 2015, and it became absolutely clear that promoting is never enough. Promoting's like marketing. You can market a product, but it doesn't mean people will change their actions. But with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in 2015, we now have a duty to deliver in Wales, to deliver on 7 goals that are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, as you can see in this chart. But very importantly, in governance terms, 5 ways of working are on the way of the Act. Thinking long-term, thinking preventatively, collaboration between organisations, integrating outcomes and involving people about whom decisions are being made. So uniquely, not only is Wales the first country to have a legal mechanism to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, but it also has the how, the 5 ways of working, as well as the what, the goals, on the face of the Act. And those goals linked to the SDGs are very clear in the idea that this is a cultural revolution, this is a societal revolution, this is an environmental revolution, and this is an economic revolution. Because nowhere on the slide of the words of the goals that are on the face of the Act will you find the word growth. What you will find is the idea of prosperity within environmental limits, of safe communities, of a responsible country globally, of health outcomes that are not linked to the performance of the health service, but to the health of the population. So a very different concept leading subsequently to different decisions. And of course, there must be accountability. So there's a Future Generations Commissioner. There's an Auditor General who audits public services and therefore has had to change their way of auditing to reflect this approach. And of course, the courts, because this is a law through judicial review. So when you have new governance, you have an opportunity to create new decisions. And it's immediately clear, particularly to somebody like me, who was a minister in the Welsh Government till 2011 and had been both an education minister and a climate minister, and very strongly supportive of initiatives, for example, to ban smacking. We couldn't get it through then, but following this new legislation, banning smacking in the interest of current and future generations sailed through the Parliament. The 20 mile an hour as a default limit across the whole of Wales, not just because of the emissions reductions, but because it improves the safety of pedestrians, because it brings down air pollution. All of those elements. So we're always looking for co-benefits. And you can see other initiatives, whether they're linked to nature and the environment, or agriculture, or renewable energy, or, very importantly, how we deliver what one planet looks like in the context of Wales. And one of the big initiatives that came out of this, but not a government initiative, has been the One Planet Standard, created so that organisations which are committed to the idea of being responsible and behaving as though there is only one planet available for use can support and deliver against a standard which both tests what they're doing, why they're doing, how they're doing and ensures that it is independently verified, but it works in an individual context where no size fits all, and therefore enables organisations across the piece from whatever sector to demonstrate good governance in practice. And part of the reason that I'm standing in front of you today is because I have been given a totally new challenge in terms of being asked to bring together a group to look at how Wales could meet net zero by 2035, according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Now, what is interesting about this, it's a formal agreement between the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, one of the opposition parties, and between the two of them, there are 2/3 of the members of the Welsh Parliament, or Senedd. This formal agreement means that Wales is once again leading the way. What will pathways look like, 10-year pathways from 2025 to 2035 that look at the impact on society and sectors of economy, that aim to be fair, aim for a just transition and aim to be nature positive. But because of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, it's not just what we're doing, but how we are doing it. And we're doing it in a way that reflects those 5 ways of working. So we are deliberately collaborative. We are integrating outcomes. We're preventative, we're long-term, and we're looking at how we're going to involve people in the decisions that we make and promote to government. We're doing it through challenges, the 4 key challenges around the big emission areas, transport, food, energy and buildings, but the very exciting opportunity about education, skills and the future of work. But of course, we don't do this in silos, although government often does. We have to think about all those other aspects, the impact on nature and the opportunities. How do we get the co-benefits? What's engagement and communication like? How do we future-proof? How can this be financed? What does governance and regulation look like? What new laws do we need? All those aspects we're going to have to into this very complex picture. And we're particularly keen to deliver on that duty of participation and engagement, involving people about whom decisions are being made. So that all the way through our work, whether it's through our individual reference groups working on those big emission areas, they are involving many people. There is open evidence gathering in terms of contributing to our thought processes. There's academic work underpinning our thought processes. We've talked to experts across the world, but we're also talking to young people in a range of communities in Wales and more widely. We're working with a set of partner organisations that when we've got something to say, we'll be using those partner organisations to spread those messages far and wide. Partner organisations such as the Hay Festival of Literature, not somebody you'd normally think of in the context of climate change, but actually how we bring together our culture, our society, our environment and our economy is not just about science and politics. It's about how we can ensure that people in their everyday lives can understand why they might need to change, but what benefits can happen to them in their daily lives because of those changes. So it's really important that when we're doing this kind of key collaborative message, that actually we engage as much as possible before we go back to government in terms of looking at how we take this agenda forward. So very simply, on this bullseye chart, we're there, right in the middle, in the public spotlight. We've determined our challenges based on scientific evidence, and scientific and academic evidence is informing us all the way through from the Wales Centre for Public Policy, a very well respected ESRC funded impact centre. We are designing into what we do participation and engagement that tackles those cross-cutting domains. We're doing this in the framework of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Emissions Act, but also going back to that slide on our ecological footprint within planetary boundaries. And planetary boundaries is right at the heart of the Welsh legislation. We started this work at the beginning of 2023, and we'll be delivering our outcomes in July of this year to the Senedd. But there is a moment at this particular moment where until the middle of February, any organisation that wants to give us evidence can go onto our website and give us evidence in any of those areas, but particularly in the context of the cross-cutting domains. Because what we want this to be is actually an opportunity for a small country that's already demonstrated leading in this area to actually also demonstrate that it is possible to achieve pathways to net zero reduction in a fair and transparent, in an ethical and nature positive way. And what is interesting across the world at the moment is no matter how many countries have signed up to global agreements in terms of 1.5 degrees, which of course we exceeded on many occasions in 2023, that actually what we're not seeing is this kind of planning, 10-year planning, in this decade, which the scientists are telling us is the most important decade for action if we're actually going to create a livable planet for current and future generations. And as a mum and a granny, I really care about that. And I'm sure everybody listening can think of the youngest person they know and the oldest person they know in their own families. And they can think of what lives they will want for the youngest person they know. And I think it's hold that thought always in the context of making sure that the decisions you take in your everyday life, whether it's about heating, buildings, how you travel, where you go on holiday, what you eat, what energy sources you use, every single one of those decisions we can take at an individual level that contributes towards better outcomes for us all. And that's critical because if we look at Professor Donella Meadows, who's one of my absolute heroes, she published the book The Limits to Growth in the 1970s and said at the time that if we weren't careful, we were going to exceed the capacity of the planet, and the planet had a capacity to exceed. And if we act the way we have been acting, then look at those three statements. The world, for all practical purposes, has no limits. If we act like that, the result is collapse. If the limits are real and there's not enough time, which is very much the kind of situation we're in at the moment, because we've known what we have to do for a very long time. We've had climate legislation in place in the UK, which used to be a global leader on these things, since 2008. So if the limits are real, but there's not enough time, the result is collapse. Because of course people try and extract as much as possible and contribute to many more emissions. So the only way forward is for us to realise that the limits are real and they're close, but there is no time to waste, that we act today and not tomorrow. And that way we create a sustainability revolution to a much better world. And that cannot be done without good governance. I love this quote back from 1979. Who is holding back rapid movement to the better society? Who is responsible for the mediocre performance of so many of our institutions? Not evil people, not stupid people, not apathetic people, not the system, not the protesters, not the disruptors, not the revolutionaries, not the reactionaries. The real enemy is fuzzy thinking on the part of good, intelligent, vital people and their failure to lead. The real enemy is fuzzy thinking. So if we think about that notion of governance, simply put, being how we do things around here, then actually do we not all have a duty to try and make that better? To be part of creating governance that is good for individual organisations, good for communities, good for countries, good for the world? And I think that if we think about where we can have impact, our little country of Wales, 3 million people, 10 million sheep, the first country to have a legislative commitment to future generations, the first country, therefore, to actually tie that legislative commitment to the performance of all its public services. What can the rest of the world do in the context of their own countries? At the moment, there are a range of countries that are looking at legislation on similar lines. Scotland is consulting on this at the moment. Ireland plans to consult on this. There are movements in Northern Ireland that are very strongly supported by the civil community in terms of taking this agenda forward. Other countries are part of a wellbeing economy, and the first United Nations Summit for the future will take place in September of this year. But what do we want to do when we're thinking about good governance? New decisions come out of good governance. I talked earlier about new governance and new decisions. Good governance can help organisations take new decisions that are more appropriate for our times. And would you not want to work for an organisation which was honest, which was evidence-based according to the science, which was transparent, clear and understandable in terms of its aims and objectives, actively was looking at being fair for current and future generations, was prepared to be accountable both to the people who work within it and anybody it deals with, to make sure that what it does is meaningful and ethical? I know that what we're seeing at the moment, which really excites me, is organisations such as Student Organising for Sustainability are finding that actually 75% of students in some institutions want to work for exactly those kinds of organisations. They want to work for organisations that are contributing towards better outcomes. In 2023, climate change was the word of the year for young people. Climate change is horrendously scary, particularly for young people who may not feel that they're in a position to do anything about it. But it is also the opportunity, like never before, to demonstrate what governance can look like. And when we think of what good governance as a mission looks like, I think the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which I'd never propose countries should adopt wholesale in any way whatsoever, but actually the principles behind it, good governance linked to sustainable development goals agreed across the world, good governance linked to the idea that what you do and how you do it should be on the face of legislation for every country, that there should be accountability measures such as the commissioners, such as audit processes, such as the courts, so that countries are demonstrating to current and future generations how they're prepared to hold themselves to account. Because, of course, the Welsh Government is not excluded from this. One of the things I was keenest to promote in the development of the legislation was the Welsh Government had to be accountable to the Commissioner, to the Auditor General and to the public, because that is the only way that governments will deliver their best if they are accountable to the same mechanisms they require the public to be accountable to. So let's go back to these 5 ways of working. How you think for the future. If you make decisions for today to repair a problem of today, you're making downstream decisions that may mean that the problem gets worse. But if you always have to think long term in terms of your decision making, if you think of this almost like a fiduciary duty, a shareholder duty where the shareholders are the human population and in fact the whole of nature population, if you have to think long term for current and future generations that enable us to live on a livable planet, then the decisions you make will be different. If you have to think preventatively so that you're causing, rather than looking at how problems are managed individually, you make sure you look at the causes, so you cause better outcomes by looking at what creates good health rather than responding to sickness. If you involve people about whom decisions are being made, then you get greater agency from people. Always when you consult people about what governments are doing, they say they don't understand how or why decisions are being made. They want more involvement. So how do we create more opportunities for more people to be more involved more of the time? How do we integrate the outcomes so that actually those goals for Wales linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 7 goals of Wales, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that we can get the co-benefits so we can demonstrate that what we're offering is a better life, where less is more and better. And how do we make sure that we collaborate, not just between 1 or 2 organisations, but at all sorts of different layers? What does multi-party collaboration look like? These are all big governance challenges. And that's why I feel that good governance has never been more important. And I am delighted to bring this challenge to the GGI and others about creating good governance for current and future generations. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you, Jane. Such a fascinating presentation with, real notes of optimism and positivity, as well as outlining the challenges ahead for us. I'm sure that you're going to give us your reflections on where we need to go next and what the path to success might look like. But I think we've also got some reflections from the panel today, when each panel member will briefly address the impact of scarcity and good governance on their particular area of expertise. And then we'll have lots of time for discussion, addressing questions and comments from the audience who are online. So I need to ask you to use the chat function, not only to make comments and discuss things, but to also put questions to the panel, and we will get to them, as many of them as we can. But I think we're first asking Andrew to respond. And Andrew is our leading thinker and commentator on modern governance. He's visiting professor at the Institute of Health at the University of Cumbria, practical facilitator and coach to boards across the public and third sectors. So, Andrew, we'll be reflecting on scarcity affecting the world of governance and what good governance looks like really within this context.
I certainly will. So let me focus on what good governance is and how it might differ from just governance, which you can look up in the dictionary. It's a 2-minute talk. It's interesting that Michael was referring back to Victorian times, and you mentioned the novel Hard Times. And a theme in that novel are people finding themselves in debtors' prisons. And in 1855, the Limited Liability Act was passed so that people who invested or ran companies and ran them honestly, ran them with good governance, didn't necessarily find themselves in debtors' prisons. So at the heart of the idea of governance is this idea of if you behave honourably and you treat people fairly and you run good systems, then, on a good day you'll make profit and do wonderful things, and if it doesn't turn out right, then you've got your clean bill of health. Now let's run forward to the 1990s, where you had a series of corporate scandals like Enron, you had political scandals like cash for questions and brown envelopes and all that. And in South Africa, you had a change of government, and Mandela saw governance as a key instrument that would retain confidence in South African institutions. He asked Mervyn King to set up the King Committee, and really GGI is the organisation that's taking forward the work of King. So you have this idea of governance through the various codes of governance in the 90s addressing legitimacy and ethics. And then the sort of final part of the ingredient is by the time you got to the year 2000, only 20% of the value of the stock market could be accounted for by what was on balance sheets about profits and performance and money and tangible assets. So where did the other 80% come from? Where did the rest of this value come from? So somewhere, companies, organisations, institutions were creating value, which was important. People would pay for it. And good boards, good stewards of companies and institutions were creating this value. So let me bring all that together. So what is good governance? Governance is a system for running organisations. Good governance is that that system is productive. And we talk about the 4 meaningful outcomes of governance, which are that you produce for your efforts an ethical culture, you have legitimacy, you have good control, but most of all, you create value. So value beyond profit and performance. So that is the difference really between governance and good governance. Governance is the system, the ticking of the boxes, the structures you might put in place, but good governance is actually delivering an impact and change. And to the point of what Jane has been talked about, it is the duty on all who run organisations, whether public or private, that they do not do their mission, they do not create their profits, they do not produce performance in a way that is subsidised by a cost to the future.
Thank you. I think before we go for questions, we're going to our next panellist, is that right?
Yeah.
So the next one is Stefan here. Stefan Stern is a management guru. He regularly writes for the Financial Times and is a co-author of Myths of Management, What People Get Wrong About Being the Boss, and the author of How to Be a Better Leader. So any responses from you to Jane's presentation and how scarcity has affected the world of leadership and management?
Well, absolutely. Thank you very much, Anna. Scarcity needn't be a disaster in the first instance. I want to try and start with a positive thought. I think it was the New Zealand Ernest Rutherford, the physicist, who said, "There is no money, we shall have to think." And scarcity could lead to creativity. It could lead to new ideas, new solutions, you know, and you call me a management guru, I won't sue you for that, but, you know, often an insulting term. But, you know, thinking outside the box, to use the classic management cliche, to be imaginative. So scarcity can help. But I think what we have seen, and Michael, you've all alluded to it so far, what there has been a terrific scarcity of in recent times among leaders and managers, I'm afraid to say, is integrity. There's been an integrity crisis or shortage in our organisations. Now, we know that inevitably there will be hierarchy effects within organisations, and we manage our careers, and there's nothing disreputable about that. But there will always be these integrity moments where we have to decide how blunt, how truthful we're going to be. And we've seen, even in recent days, scandals being revealed, stories being told that hadn't been told fully. And what you see again and again is that failure of integrity. So I thought Jane was very helpful when she talked about mission and values and the danger of fuzzy thinking as opposed to clear thinking. And we could add, couldn't we, fuzzy moral, fuzzy morality, fuzzy moral confusion and fuzzy thinking. So I'm hopeful that we will see a change. I'm hopeful that we are at a sort of turning point. Journalists like to always say that we're either at a crossroads or a turning point. is one of the two. But I think there is a widespread public reaction and revulsion at the scarcity of integrity and bad behaviour. And bad behaviour in leaders and managers challenges and shatters norms that we've all accepted and grown up with and lived by, most of us, much of the time. I think that's why it's so unsettling when we see persistently bad, unpunished behaviour. Lots of elections in 2024. We must hope for some good outcomes, I think, and at least some change from that lack of integrity that we've been living through.
Thank you very much. We're going to come back to you, Jane, but I was sort of struck by, I've been thinking this through, this theme of scarcity and constraints and the potentials it has in some ways. So one of my roles has been a commissioner of public arts in public buildings, in the health buildings. And it's an example that we had to create a multi-faith chapel for all faiths or none. And we had the challenge there of taking out all religious iconography so as not to exclude people. And that was a real challenge, but it was actually a really positive challenge. And we ended up in a space in the Louisa Martindale building, which is framed floor to ceiling by the sea. It's very high up. And it has, a bit like your picture that we gave you today, it has a series of portraits of the sea at different times of day and night. No words. And underneath it, there are some little cards, postcards that people can write on, talking about what they're going through, what their loved ones are going through, there's a communal aspect to being able to enjoy that together or to take solace from that. So it's a really good example of how scarcity in that context has created something quite wonderful, which unites people and which gives people a feeling of positivity. And I think that's relevant, particularly because people all say that when they feel, particularly in coastal towns, being by the sea is something that really helps them. So that's an example of meeting a really difficult challenge and creating something fantastic out of it. So I'd like you, that's my personal reflection on those challenges of scarcity, but I'd like you to sort of take us back, if you will, to where you think the path forward lies, because your lecture was incredibly optimistic in some ways. So what's the path that you can see for us?
Well, I'd like to come back to that point of integrity, really, because politicians have always been pretty lowly rated in terms of the expectations of the public, but they've never been as low as they are at the moment. And I think that there is almost like a kind of governance duty on the political classes, and that doesn't just mean the politicians, it means the people behind the politicians, the people involved in policy initiatives, the people who want to see better outcomes for current and future generations, to think about how we're going to get more confidence in democratic decision-making. And I think it's what you did in your example, in terms of creating something that is available to all faiths and none, was to be completely inclusive. Mm-hmm. You worked with a set of citizens with a very wide range of different views in terms of bringing something together that could work in a way that could speak to all of them. And I think that notion about being inclusive is a really, really important aspect here. Although I wasn't explicit about this in the lecture, we do hope, as part of our work, to have a citizens' assembly. And I think that that policymakers need to be confident when they talk to the public about whether or not an idea is good enough to test on the public, rather than what normally happens, and I know, and I'm sure I've been guilty of it in the past, which is to think that we have a good idea, to have a government consultation, and then carry on with our good idea with perhaps a small amount of amendment. But really, the public wants to be well governed. They are part of a democratic institution that chooses who government is. So if there is a better dialogue between people and government, a dialogue that is inclusive, that does involve people about whom decisions are being made, that will have greater understanding of the challenges we face and give government greater confidence to take some decisions that are going to be very hard because they have been hidden from the public so far. So I think there's a notion about integrity, and there's a notion about democracy, and there's a notion about inclusivity, and I can only see this being positive, because where there have been citizens' assemblies in place, for example, we have seen far greater understanding of what needs to happen, and then you end up in a bizarre situation for many, which is organisations calling for regulation. Because if they've got level playing field regulation, they're all in the same place, and that can help us all. So let's take integrity, let's take inclusion and inclusivity, let's take the people, and let's look at how together we can make better decisions. And for us in Wales, I really want to see the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act be a People's Act, where the people of Wales can effectively slap a virtual copy of the Act down on a policymaker's desk and say, you've got to do this, and I want you to do this. And I think that will help us all.
Thank you. And I think, does that take us back?
I think we can start just with one question from the chat. There's a lot of questions about, but what about England? How can we make progress in England? Do we need devolved powers, as the devolved nations do, or how can we get out of various scarcity problems here in England? Are there any frameworks or programs, any signs of hope?
We need marmot cities. Perhaps I can invite Michael to tell us a bit about them.
Well, we've been working in a devolved way for two reasons. One is, when I made a set of recommendations in 2010 at what to do to improve health and reduce health inequalities, and then in 2020 looked back at what had happened, and essentially we'd gone in the opposite direction in all of my recommendations. Child poverty had gone up, spending on education had gone down, the gig economy had exploded, more people in poverty, and so on. All got worse. But we got a lot of take-up, marmot cities, at a local area. Gwent was the first marmot region in Wales. We got a lot of take-up. So a negative reason for working locally was because central government was going in the wrong direction. A positive reason is that local government is much closer to the conditions where people are born, grow, live, work and age, the social determinants of health. And it involved local government, the health and care system, the voluntary and community sector, and the police, the fire and rescue service, education. We've now got business involved. And they get together in this cross-government way. Now, in Wales, they can do that at a national level. It's the same population as Greater Manchester. So if Greater Manchester can do it, in a way Wales can do it, or if Wales can do it, Greater Manchester can do it. But they have this cross-government action, and it's really encouraging. Now, it doesn't let national government off the hook. If they've taken decisions that lead to an increase in child poverty, it makes the task at city, local, district, regional level much more difficult. If they've reduced spending on education per pupil more in deprived areas than in non-deprived areas, which what they've done, I can't think of how you would justify that. I'm just out of potential. I try and get inside people's heads and think, what are they thinking? But I can't get inside anybody's head and say, why would you reduce the spend per pupil on education more in deprived areas than in non-deprived areas? In what universe is that anything other than immoral? But that means if that's what's going on, the challenge at local area is even more demanding. But so that's a kind of devolution. And I think it fits with the Brown Commission on governance for England of having more decisions happen at the city and regional level.
Can I just give some heart to the questioner? There is a campaign which is led by Lord John Bird, who set up the Big Issue, called Today for Tomorrow, which is actually campaigning for a future generations commissioner in England. And I think that just as, Wales was at the forefront of establishing a children's commissioner, and now they're in all 4 nations. And I think something similar will happen here in due course. And the fact that the UN is going to establish its own envoy for future generations, following in the wake of Wales and other countries that are taking this sort of approach, I think we'll probably see quite a lot of commissioners for future generations appear, particularly in local countries such as Scotland or Ireland, which are already on the journey. It'll be much harder for England to say they don't care about current and the relationship between current and future generations if other countries have those mechanisms in place. So it's the beginning of a journey, but if anybody on the call wants to take it forward by lobbying, please do so.
I'd like to sort of ask a question myself. So we're all here agreeing that if you run a company, or you're an elected politician, or you run a public sector organisation, you should have concern for the effects of what you do on the well-being of society. And indeed, actually, if you run an NHS organisation, in England, you're tied into the achievement of net zero. It's actually in last year's Act, and also in your code of governance, you must have due regard to the population you serve. That's difficult in a context of where, performance and financial targets are really important. Now, what good boards should do, in my view, is push back. And I think that speaks to your point about integrity, and I think that is difficult. I think it is more difficult for people who are executives, who it's their day job, it's paying their mortgage, than non-executives. But at what point or how would you encourage people on public boards to push back when they see themselves in a position where they know what they are doing is creating damage to people's health, which is subsidising their performance? I'll give you a real example. If you are an NHS organisation in London that does not subscribe to the London Living Wage, you are paying people at less of a level than we know they need to remain healthy. So maybe you could offer some advice about that.
Well, we were approached, the Institute of Health Equity at UCL, were approached by Legal & General, not a small company. I think they have £1.3 trillion under investment. So, and they asked, we'd like to know what we could do in our day job that would improve health and reduce health inequalities. And we said 3 things. We produced a report, The Business of Health Equity, the Marmot Review for Industry, and we said 3 things. 1, exactly what you just said, conditions of employment. Everybody should earn a real living wage and have personal development opportunities for advancement, good conditions of work and the like. The second was goods and services. Is what you do in your day job good for health or bad for health? If you're the tobacco industry, we can't work with you. What you do is bad for health. If you're the food industry, we all need the food industry. It can be good for health or bad for health. We'd like you to move in a direction that's good for health. And the third is the wider impact on the community, the environment, procurement, and the like. An NHS organisation, the East London Foundation Trust, said, hey, we could do that. We can think about the people we employ. We could think about our service users, what we give to them, and be an anchor institution. Think about the impact. What we didn't do, maybe Stefan could answer that. What we didn't do is what you do if they're behaving badly on these three criteria. We gave them a way forward, and what Legal in General said was, look, our starting position is we have to make a profit. That's what we have to do. We're in business to make money. Of course we are. They said on the first of those, good employment, it's a no-brainer. That's good for the bottom line. It's good for us to have employees that are healthy and satisfied and productive. So paying them and treating them properly, I mean, it's a basic resource. For ESG, that's environment, social and governance, that's a cliche, but what they did say is we should add H, health. We should look at the impact of what we do on health. And on the third, it comes back to what you said, I think, earlier, Jane. We quite like regulation. You know, they say it sotto voce, you know, because business is supposed to be against regulation. But a level playing field is really quite a good thing because you can't then be undercut by bad actors.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to bring more people in, but I'm not sure. I think, are we tight for time in terms of going to our next speaker?
Well, I was thinking we could hear what Jaideep's got to say so far and then come back to more questions.
We'll do that, yes. So on that cue, I'd like to introduce our final panellist, Professor Jaideep Prabhu, who is no stranger to the GGI Annual Lecture, having delivered it himself in 2021. He's the author of Frugal Innovation, How to Do More with Less, and co-author of Jagged Innovation, Think Frugal, Be Flexible, Generate Breakthrough Growth, which was described by The Economist as the most comprehensive book yet on the subject of frugal innovation. Jaideep's annual lecture presentation in 2021 was on the topic of his much acclaimed book, How Should a Government Be?
Thank you so much, Anna, for that introduction. And it's so wonderful to be joining all of you today. I'm sorry I can't be there with you. I was teaching a class until 4, but I'm joining you digitally, which is a wonderful example of frugal innovation in action, or Jugaad as it's known in India. It's been wonderful to sit here in my office in Cambridge and listen to this conversation. And I've made copious notes because there are so many very interesting observations that each of you have made, particularly Jane in her lecture. First of all, I want to say I love the theme of this annual lecture, the idea that good governance because scarcity is real. And while listening to that and thinking about good governance and scarcity, I had a parallel soundtrack going on in my head, which said innovation because scarcity is real. But I was struggling initially to make the connection between good governance and innovation until Andrew gave us a wonderful definition of good governance, which was, in his words, creating value beyond profit. And that's exactly what innovation is meant to do. So there was a connection right there. The other reason why I want to talk about innovation and scarcity is because I've spent the last 2 decades studying innovation under conditions of scarcity. Prior to that, I had studied innovation in large Western corporations where scarcity wasn't an issue. There were resources. But then I turned my attention to developing countries like India, where I'd grown up, and their scarcity is real. It's a very significant part of people's everyday life. And even though the Indian economy has grown steadily since the early 90s, the fact is that large numbers of people still remain outside the formal economy and lack access to many of the basic necessities. So as Sir Michael was saying, inequality is real in many countries of the world, such as India, and particularly in areas like health. And those inequalities exist in a context of the climate crisis. So how has a country like India responded to this real scarcity? The response, to a great extent, has not, unfortunately, come from the state. It has not come from the government. It has come from people. In health, for instance, it has come from doctors who are concerned about how many people, for instance, go needlessly blind because they cannot afford a simple cataract operation, or people who die of heart disease because they cannot afford a heart operation. And so this is where, to Stefan's point, what we see in a country like India is that scarcity, the lack of money, forces people to think and act in creative ways. The lack of resources forces them to be resourceful. So just in the area of health, we have innumerable examples of frugal innovations, often, as I said, by doctors, in participation, in collaboration with people in communities. And this was a very interesting theme of Jane's as well, the importance of participation and engagement. So India, in some ways, in this sense of facing scarcity and in this sense of having frugal innovations, is a microcosm for many other parts of the world. The World Bank estimates that possibly half the world's population, maybe 3.5 billion people, live on less than $9 a day adjusted for PPP. Many of these people face significant deprivations, particularly in areas like health and education. And for instance, in other parts of Asia or Africa or Latin America. And in Africa, over the last 2 decades, we've seen a revolution in frugal innovations in health. A lot of them around the mobile phone, and M-Health, very significant innovations there, using simple text messaging, for instance, to reach people, to get good education and health to people. Another country that I have studied quite closely is Bangladesh, which I started to visit annually since 2012, where I encountered a very remarkable organization called BRAC, which in some ways is a parallel government in Bangladesh. It's by some accounts the world's largest NGO. It was started in 1971 when Bangladesh gained its independence to address a very significant problem that people were facing in Bangladesh through the 70s of very high infant and child mortality. Many children were dying from diarrhea and dysentery. They were actually dying from dehydration because of contaminated water. And the solution, a very frugal solution, had been developed in Bangladesh itself, oral rehydration solutions. The unfortunate thing was that those oral rehydration solution packs at 8 cents a person were too expensive for people to afford. And even the government could not afford it and could not get it to people in remote areas. This is where BRAC came in, and they introduced a very ingenious approach to this. They went to the communities and trained women in communities to train mothers in how to make this oral rehydration solution in their homes. And this brings us back to something Jane mentioned often, which is a key principle of governance, is engaging the people themselves about whom we are making decisions. And this is what BRAC did as a matter of principle, community-led development and participation. The other irony is that these frugal innovations that we've seen in countries like Bangladesh, India, and various African economies is partly because of a lack of governance. As I said, because of the state has failed many people in those countries. However, many of those governments are now richer. Those countries are growing. Government, they have found ways to increase their tax base, and there is pressure on them to spend more, for instance, on health, to spend more on education. And a big, remarkable development in many of these countries is better governance around digital infrastructure. For instance, in India, there's been a remarkable set of developments to bring a lot of people who are outside the formal economy, outside the banking system, into the banking system, and to do this very frugally, often using mobile-based telephony and payments. And we see this across Asia, we see this across Africa and Latin America. So these are some thoughts in response to the many interesting ideas that I heard each of the speakers share with us. And I'll return I'll hand it back to you, Anna, for further thoughts and comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Jaideep, and the rest of our panel for a really, really fascinating discussion. I believe we have questions and comments coming in from the chat. I will ask you if you could read them out for us, if that's okay.
Yeah, so it sort of leads on from Jaideep's presentation. How can ordinary citizens, people that are not on boards, people who do not have power, how can they hold leaders to account? What do we, as leaders, need from people now as we go from scarcity crisis to scarcity crisis, and it is becoming normal not to behave in with integrity?
There's a two-word encouraging answer to that, which is Toby Jones, isn't there, at the moment? But I think that's a really good question. I don't know who asked it. It's a really good question.
Yes, I mean, in theory, we now have this famous social media. We now have ways of getting our voices heard as individuals. And maybe it's a criticism of mainstream media. I'm the reluctant representative of that today, you know, because Toby Jones in a drama brought something home to people and politicians in a way that journalists had certainly been trying to report and had assiduously reported, but somehow had not quite conveyed to the public. And there's a media theory that because it wasn't a Westminster story, because it wasn't a lobby journalism story, that it didn't really land, whereas specialists and trade publications and so on and Private Eye were pursuing it. But it's no use speaking up unless those in power are able to listen. And it is also, was it Upton Sinclair who said it's difficult to persuade someone of the fact of something if their job depends on them not believing it. So again, back to integrity and listening and respecting the well-informed views of people who know what they're talking about, wherever they are in society.
However, I do think in an election year that the public have a much bigger opportunity than they would otherwise. And I'm not sure that everybody realises they have that opportunity. Because in an election year, parties have to present their policies to the public. And quite often, when I've talked to people in the past, I mean, you know, my role was as a politician in Wales, but when I've talked to people who are very unhappy with what a government is doing, whether it's in Westminster or Wales or anywhere else, and the second question to them is, well, have you told them? And they never have. So in a sense, in the rooms across the UK, there'll be all sorts of people very unhappy with their politicians, but they won't tell the politicians how unhappy they are. So in an election year, there's a massive opportunity to be very clear about what your priorities are, and to particularly make it clear in terms of your local current representatives and potentially your local future representatives, what things you want government to do. And this is not at a micro level, but this is at a macro level. Can you give the political parties in the UK confidence to act on the big challenges facing us? Because at the moment, you feel that that is what is in retreat, when we've never needed that more.
But there's a style of leadership as well that if we're talking about, yes, vote, but in sort of everyday sort of intercourse with large public sector organisations, there are some which we know from the governance reviews that we do are, you know, authentically listening, and they have a style of leadership where what the porter says or what a family member says really counts. You mentioned ELFT, East London Foundation Trust. You know, I'd add, I think there's a really impressive small trust at Warrington called Bridgewater Community, and you sit through their board meetings and you can see that they're actually driven by a concern for listening. He won't thank me for saying this, but I know that the new chief exec of Manchester University Foundation Trust, if a member of staff sends him an email, he'll respond. He's got 30,000 staff. Good on him. But there's a style of presence in leadership that does genuinely and authentically listen and take action when somebody has a worry or concern or an idea of an improvement point.
I mean, my response is that nothing ever really got changed without a social movement. And asking what an individual can do, join a social movement, whether it was the women's movement, the trade union movement, civil rights, these are movements. They didn't get a Voting Rights Act in the United States by a few individuals complaining. There was a whole social movement to get the Voting Rights Act. Regrettably, it's been eroded by the Supreme Court. But I think what individuals can do is to be part of a social movement. It may be their community, it may be their trade union, their church group, whatever it is, you have much more power as part of a group.
I mean, I think that's really positive because we know that with social media, we do have those opportunities to be very connected. And I was reflecting on Jaydeep's discussions around some of the grassroots organisations in Bangladesh. Actually, my mother worked on one of those feeding programmes, so that's dear to my heart. And when the use of mobile technology does give us those opportunities, it also has some terrible downsides of it in terms of misinformation and spreading things that aren't through social media, which are counter to people's actual interests. But certainly I hear what you're saying about the power of social movements.
And I think in terms of influencing and using social media and being individuals who join groups, just going back to that wonderful picture you gave me, so just look at what Fergal Sharkey and others have done about clean water in our seas and rivers. I mean, that is now an extraordinary campaign in every single part of the UK, and all those water companies are having to be held to account. Ofwat is having to change its rules. I guarantee that the two main political parties in the UK will say something about how they're going to clean up water in their election manifestos. So actually, if the public rise behind an issue, then politicians have to take it into account. This is the year that the public needs to decide what they're going to rise about.
Thank you. Do we have some other questions?
Yeah, there's some more questions. I wonder which one to start with first. There's quite a lot of worry about when governance gets added to the process or when cross-party collaboration is sought, the project becomes really expensive and too difficult to deliver on time. Have the panel any thoughts on that?
Well, a lack of governance can be quite an expensive day out. I take the example of the poor old British Library. They had a ransomware attack. One can hypothesise that information governance maybe wasn't of the standard it needed to be. £600,000 was demanded of them. Well, naturally they're not paying it, but the correction so far has cost, I understand, 65 million. So good governance, part of it is a stitch in time saves 65 million.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent, the last 20 years working in the governance of NHS construction programmes, and I would probably say that it's absolutely essential. Yes, sometimes it does feel like everything takes a long time, but in order to make decisions and to justify investment and to make sure the investment goes to the right place, there needs to be certain things put in place. Otherwise, you could find yourselves building something that's going to fall down in 20 years.
And look at the cost of the post office. I mean, they've set aside £1 billion or something for the compensation. Absolutely appalling damage done to large numbers of people, and the reputation of the post office having suffered, and a vast bill. And I would bet my chemise that at the root of this there will be a governance failing.
Thank you.
There's an interesting question here about, so Jane was mentioning new governance, new decisions. What about new technology like artificial intelligence? Is that going to power good governance, take it forward? How would that affect?
Well, certainly a case for effective governance of AI. I mean, I don't think we want
That
robots
yes.
taking decisions. They're very powerful at sifting data. I think that's true. I think in medicine we've seen the growth of AI, you know, for scans and things. They don't get tired. You know, they will spot things that a tired radiologist might not spot, but not on their own. Not unsupervised, not ungoverned. No. I mean, we should respect the power and deploy the power of AI, but I think Homo sapiens must remain in charge of them, is my view.
I agree with that completely. I just want to come back to what Jane said earlier about our lack of regard for our politicians. It's true, all the evidence shows, if you ask people who do you trust to tell the truth, politicians are way down the bottom. It doesn't have to be that way.
No.
In Switzerland, the majority of people trust their politicians. Yeah. It's not intrinsic to the role of politics. My own prejudice, and this is a prejudice, I don't know if it's evidence-based, but my prejudice is every time one of our national politicians lies, the public trust of politicians goes down a bit. I don't know if that's true, but I'd like to think it were true. That one way to improve trust in politicians, stop lying. Start telling the truth for a change. Now, it doesn't fit with the zeitgeist. You know, you've got to say we're delivering for the British people, everything's getting better. It's not. I mean, my own view about Brexit is that people have been lied to so consistently in the north, the east and the northwest, the parts that were uniformly for Brexit, about how the economy was improving, everything was getting better. And then the same politicians who told them that everything was getting better, which they knew wasn't true because they shopped in the supermarket and knew what they could afford. And those same politicians then said, you know, if we leave the European Union, things will get worse. Well, you've been lying to us consistently. Why should we believe you about that? I think that might well have been part of it. And we were lied to consistently about Brexit. So my own prejudice is part of the reason for our mistrust of politicians is because they've earned that mistrust. They work at it every day. And we need to change that.
I think that on the other side of the coin, you can say that the people who are well respected by the public, doctors, nurses, teachers, all of whom have evidence-based backgrounds, and particularly those who work in the health service who are scientists. And I think there's, you know, the public does have a great trust in those people who have devoted their lives to getting the expertise on the basis of which they take the decisions. So going right back to this idea that evidence-based policy, which I think you're probably the first person I ever heard iterate that in a really major way, we have to bring evidence-based policy back into the public and political discourse. And if you bring that back, it means that the things which at the moment the government are not addressing, the polycrises of nature or climate would be at the top of my list of those. But you could look at all the elements in terms of how we fund, what we fund, whether or not we can protect future generations. If the fiduciary duty is to shareholders, is it current shareholders, which is what the duty is now, but if we made it current and future shareholders, it would immediately change the way decisions were made. So there are all sorts of opportunities as well in terms of good policy making that can take the problems of today and turn them into some of the opportunities of tomorrow. And AI will play a part in that. But we need to have AI that is subordinate to the decisions which are actually about the survival of not just the human race, but nature, when we're part of nature.
I'm just going to take Chair's prerogative for a minute. And just something I wanted to ask you, Michael, earlier, because we had a brief moment just after COVID when there was a real recognition of health inequalities and how COVID had disproportionately affected that. And now that seems to have, I know the COVID inquiry is ongoing, so perhaps it'll come out of that. But that seemed to be a widespread recognition that there was an impact, and it made health inequalities absolutely centre stage. But do you think that's gone backwards now? We've lost that.
I'm not sure I should say this, but the lawyers for the COVID inquiry wrote to me and asked me not to comment on the evidence given by other witnesses. And I said, have you got a legal basis for asking me not to comment? No, but we'd rather you didn't. So let me comment on the
We're all on the edge of our seats now.
Well, Claire Bamber and I presented evidence that the rise of inequalities pre-COVID had meant we were ill-prepared for managing COVID. I gave evidence on a Friday. On Monday, former Prime Minister David Cameron gave evidence. It was put to him. Professor Marmot told us that the rise of inequalities, etc. He said, Professor Marmot's wrong. And then George Osborne gave evidence on the Tuesday. Professor Marmot told us, he said, I reject that completely. So there's two politicians. One is in the House of Lords now, and the other has a podcast and is pontificating, and they reject it completely. There's the evidence. You talk about evidence. There's the evidence. It's inconvenient, so they reject it. They reject it. They don't like it because it shows them in a bad light, because their policies damage the country. And I'm not arguing as a politician. I'm arguing as somebody who spends every day of my life looking at the evidence relating to health and health inequalities. And there we were, that COVID increased the inequalities. People in overcrowded living conditions, working in frontline occupations, particular ethnic groups, Black African, Black Caribbean, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian to a lesser extent, had high COVID rates. There was the evidence right before our very eyes. Yep. Did I hear any of our national politicians in government say, right, we realise we got things wrong, now we've got to pay attention? No, they say we're making things better. No, you're not. All the evidence is you're making things worse. So, no, I think there were lessons to be learned. Regrettably, the current people in power haven't learnt those lessons. And I'd either like them to learn the lessons if they want to stay in power, or be replaced by a government that's ready to learn those lessons and act on them.
Thank you. Very full answer. Thank you.
I wanted to come in. I was sort of potentially chastened by that ask for Mark for making it, but I was about to give two cheers for British democracy by comparing it with American democracy. So if you want to find out how many members of Parliament have been excluded in the last session, there's a bit on the website you can go. There's actually a spreadsheet that you can download. And there's a whole long spreadsheet, and there are 69 exclusions, I think it is, of a sort of reason why, and a hyperlink through to the report. So you could go, well, 650 MPs, roughly 69 have been excluded. You could go, gosh, that's terrible. The other thing you could say is, well, at least we've got a system that works. And when you look at what happened to the former Prime Minister Johnson, and that he was actually excluded to the point where he, in fear of facing a by-election, he resigned. And you compare that to America and the impeachment, the second impeachment of Trump, who had, you know, organised and a full-on assault on democracy. You can say, well, maybe it's a little bit better here. But the propensity of politicians not to be reflective, not to be able to say, yes, I got it wrong, or I'm sorry, I don't know, or yes, we must do better, is a sad one, and actually I think it is essential for them to do that, to rekindle a trust in democracy, a trust in public institutions, a trust in leadership, which actually, if we don't have, we are served very poorly.
I mean, if forgive this personal note, but you know, you've heard me. I'm quite critical of what's going on at the moment because I looked at the evidence. Last year, a year ago, I got given a high honour, and I thought to myself, you know, there are many countries, maybe a majority, where I'd be censored. I wouldn't be able to speak up and say what I say. And in Britain, not only am I allowed to do it, not only am I encouraged, I was honoured for doing it. Well, that says something good about this country. You know, with all the criticisms that I have about where we are and what's happened to health, but you know, we're able to talk to each other. We're able to speak up. We're able to be critical. There's not many countries. The Economist Intelligence Unit looks at how many countries have a full democracy. It's, I think, at 25 maximum. It was 22, 1 year 25. We're one of them. But out of 167 that they rank, they're only at most 25 with a full democracy. The US now has a flawed democracy. They don't make it into the top group. So we've got a lot to be proud of and a lot to build on. And it's in that context that some of us make the criticisms that we do.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to come back to our questions because there may be people that want to ask.
I think
Is that okay?
one final question really leads on from that. Is good governance a threat to the system? Should it be? Can it be? In which way? How does government and governance, where do they meet?
Shall I go last?
I would have thought good governance is a threat to bad behaviour.
Yeah.
Effective, proper governance, good governance, will drive out bad actors, you would hope. And I think the other encouraging point, following on from what Michael just saying, I think the British people, if we're talking mainly to a British audience today, do have a limited appetite for shamelessness. And that is a difference between us and America. I think something odd has happened in America with almost half the country adopting or pursuing a different form of reality and facts to the other half. That hasn't happened here, thank goodness. And that's also an encouraging thought, perhaps that, you know, that sometimes people have just had enough of bad behaviour collectively. And this might be the moment we're in now. So good governance is good. The clue's in the name.
I see good governance as absolutely central to the culture of organisations. And if you've got a culture of good governance, you're engaging with the people who work in the organisation and the stakeholders and agreeing outcomes that are increasing value, as you said at the very beginning, Andrew. Which means I also see good governance as the permission to think differently, because we can't say we're in a good space at the moment. So we need different kinds of governance for the next decade in terms of being able to get different decisions that are better for all of us. So if we see good governance as the culture of the organisation, as the permission to think differently, then in a sense it needs to be accountable, but not in a tick box way. And I think that's incredibly important. Otherwise, the system takes over from the outcomes. So it's good governance is about achieving the outcomes of better value while having a system that is accountable but light enough to release the imagination.
I know the problem, but I don't know the answer. The problem, take the issue of tax. If you ask me to make an argument for a lower rate of tax, I could do it. If you ask me to make the argument for a higher rate of tax, I could do it. You know, do we want a lower tax rate so we can pay off the national debt, so rich people can keep more of their money? Do we want higher tax rates for redistribution, for investment? It'd be quite good to have a public debate about that. And you flush out people's views. And I'm not saying anybody's right. I have my own views. I quite think public services and redistribution are quite a good thing. So they're my views, but they're not the right views. They're my views. And there are other views. Let's have a public debate, but we don't have a public debate. everybody's scared stiff. It's either lower tax rates or don't lower tax rates, but not what kind of society do we want and where does the taxation, etc. We don't have this public debate, and I don't see how we can have good governance without it. And as I say, I can see the problem. I'm not sure what the solution is to, firstly, stop attacking the BBC, allow that to be a good forum for that debate, have our media to be more like the Financial Times, where those debates happen. They're much more in the FT than they do in much of the rest of the media. So I don't have a solution to this, but it has to be an important part of good governance.
Thank you. Andrew, you're going to come with some closing words on the last question?
I shall come with some closing words on the last question. Am I coming with the closing words to the whole event?
No, because we've got Jacko to bring in yet.
That will come. I think that,
we'll come back to you.
If you look at the figures for the huge number of third sector organisations there are in this country, or just clubs, there's an enormous number of citizens, millions of us, in some way or another, put their name forward to help run something, and they sit on a board, whether it's a local swimming group or it's a multinational organisation. And I think that there's encouragement in any system where people say, yes, I will take on accountability for an organisation or an entity. And I think actually that's a very noble thing. I love my work, and the people we work with, the people who sit on boards, the people who ensure that the governance processes work, strike me as people of enormous personal integrity who know that our time on this planet is but brief, and what they do should matter, and they do it by wanting to ensure that whether it's for, as I said, the local swimming group or a multinational, runs well, effectively, and with integrity. And actually, a governance system is one where the sum of the parts is less than the whole that is created.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to add to that I'm on the board of a voluntary sector organisation that works with homeless people, as you know. And I think without that board, that charity would not have survived. I know it's a requirement legally to have a board, but the people who give their time freely to make it happen and to bring in their extra resources and time and commitment and expertise, they are what's best about being in this country. And that relates back to your theme about community organisation and Jaydeep's theme as well. So that's a really nice closing note for that, so thank you. Which takes me to yourself, I believe, to talk about why you've chosen this theme today, and also obviously to thank GGI for organising this event. And tell me about this theme, what it means to you.
Well, scarcity means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it seemed an obvious theme with us, in 2023 and now in 2024, hurtling from one crisis to the next. But when I meditated on this, or what scarcity means, the first thing that came to mind to me was peace. It's just, even in your own life, just to find a moment of peace. So I was hoping we could sort of just kind of shake off the debate. It's been a lot of really heavy topics have been raised, and if we could just all take in a deep breath and out to relax, then, I know that taking a breath wouldn't immediately alleviate any major conflict, but as you take a minute for yourself, trust that if you can achieve peace within yourself, then you can communicate peacefully with your loved ones, with each other, with other board members, and you can begin then to strive for peace in your community. So as this is not so much a peaceful demonstration, but more like a demonstration of peace, I would like you to invite you just to take 3 more breaths, just one more breath for peace. And because when we have peace, everything else has a place to fall into place. And 2 more times, just once more for love. Breathe for love, because love is everything, and without air, we have nothing. And the final time, let us breathe for joy, because without joy, we don't have a festival. And when we have peace and love, we have joy. Thank you, everyone, today. And whenever you feel things are getting too much, just remember to breathe. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everyone who participated in the annual lecture. We signed on. Thank you, our speaker, Jane. Thank you very much, Anna, for chairing today. And thank you for our panelists. You've all given freely of your time, and you are all committed to the cause of peaceful organisation. Also, thank you to Richard and the crew at Broadly TV Studios who filmed and streamed this event for us at cost. They did this because they believe in our message of scarcity being both painfully real for those who experience it, but if we collaborate peacefully, it is possible for us all to live well on this beautiful planet. Thank you again to the artist Tim Nathan, who donated his work for the Good Governance Award. And finally, thank you to everyone at GGI, especially Roisin Jenkins, Martin Thomas, and Helen Williams, who worked very hard to make this a success. Peace, everybody, and trust that the peace you feel will resonate with the people you surround yourself with, your loved ones, neighbours, your community. And if it doesn't, just breathe. Peace.
And does that take us to closing words from Andrew?
Yeah, Andrew, have you got anything to say?
Well, I shall try not to hyperventilate with the need. And I'd just like to add to that list of thanks to Jacques, whose inspiration has created the last 9 festivals of governance. And I'd like to invite you all to be regular visitors to our website, to come along to our events. They're all free, to join some of our networks, which are, again, there for taking. We have an advisory service, which again, for smaller organisations, which again is free. And we are publishers of everything we learn, we share. We don't believe that knowledge is something which is a personal property, and it's all there on our website. So please do, make use of that if you're one of the millions of people in this country who, whether it's on such an excellent smaller charity like Seaview, which makes sure that people who are homeless have some kind of hope and practical help, all the way through to colleagues who sit on, who are parts of governments or who are public influencers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.